Good afternoon again. We have another amazing panel ahead of us. We live in a very challenging times, when it comes to information, when it comes to news, when it comes to what to trust, what not to trust, and we will touch upon these subjects, and we will touch upon the new challenges the journalists and people who bring the news to the public are facing, and how they are dealing with it. I've got three very, very distinguished guests today. First is Pavla Holcová. She is one of the leading investigative journalists in the Czech Republic. She is also a founder of the Czech Center for Investigative Journalism. We have Bruce Jacobs, who he's a long life journalist, started at CNN a long time ago, then moved to Prague and became a member of Radio Free Europe team. He is now a managing editor of Radio Free Europe. And we have Tim Lister, who is also a long life journalist. Tim and I, we met first time in 1999 at CNN in Atlanta. Before that, he was working with BBC. He went through a lot of functions within CNN, from producer to vice president. He was running a newsroom. He is also still active, one of the leading investigative journalists for CNN, and he's an author. One of his books was published. Agent Storm was published also in the Czech Republic. He's got also a new book out called 9 Lives, which is a fascinating account of Al-Qaeda operative working with MI6, the secret services of Great Britain. Thank you very much for coming. I will start with Pavla. Pavla, what prompted you to open a center of investigative journalism in Prague? And that's one question. Second question is, why would you become an investigative journalist? It's a lot of work, and it's not necessarily the safest work.
Okay, I will take this mic. Okay, it's an old story. Actually, the idea to open the Czech Center for Investigative Journalism and became investigative journalist came to my mind in jail. I used to work for people in need. I used to work in Cuba with Cuban independent journalists, and one day we went there to give a training to the journalists with Paul Radu, who is originally from Romania. Recently, he's like the global investigative journalist, one of the superstars. And we've been giving trainings, and one night we got drunk with someone who was smuggling arms to Cuba, even though there was embargo on bringing arms from Europe to Cuba. And we were happy. We asked him many questions. Surprisingly, he answered those questions, but at 4 a.m. the Cuban police came and they put us in jail for meeting people we were not supposed to meet. And for the first time during the trainings and trips and moving from one dissident to another, we had a time to talk. And Paul actually described me what he is doing, that he's investigative journalist and he's doing those international projects. And he told me that Czech Republic is kind of a black hole in the middle of Europe, that they have no contacts there. They can follow smuggling cigarettes, smuggling people up to the borders of Czech Republic, then they know nothing, and they need to start from the zero in Germany, where they have the contacts once again. So I decided once I will quit people in need, I will do this job. And that's what happened.
Bruce, I grew up in communism. I grew up spoon-fed by the information by the Communist Party. And one of our channels where we got a real information was Radio Free Europe. I have a huge respect for this organization. However, communism in Central Europe and Eastern Europe collapsed. What is the role of Radio Free Europe? Can you tell me a little bit about the Radio Free Europe today, of the second decade of the 21st century?
Dobré odpoledne. Yes, Radio Free Europe, based in Prague, broadcasts to 23 different countries. We used to do Czechoslovakia, then Czech Republic. We stopped about 15 years ago. So we don't focus on Czech Republic anymore, but we are in all the former Soviet countries, Iran, Afghanistan. We do Pakistan, but we were just shut down in January by the authorities there. So we're one of the larger news organizations in the world. We have 17 bureaus. In Prague, we have 700 employees. We have more than 25 languages spoken there. English is just a small fraction of what we do. So if you look at the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty website in English, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty does. We are surrogate broadcasters. We have people from Turkmenistan, from Azerbaijan, from Afghanistan, in Prague, also in bureaus in many of these countries, doing news for the people in those countries, from the inside and from outside.
Tim, I introduce you as an investigative journalist. Two questions or two-part question. What attracts you on investigative journalism, and what kind of investigation are you focusing on, please?
Well, believe it or not, as a representative of fake news and an enemy of the people, as I'm often described, along with my colleagues, we spend a lot of our time looking into whatever links there may or may not have been between Trump associates and Russia and the United Arab Emirates and others. So that's a big part of our investigative work at the moment because, of course, it's going on in the US. It's all-consuming with the Mueller investigation. But we also look, for example, at stories like Brexit, how that was financed, where the money came from. And I think one of the big changes in the recent past doing investigative journalism is the amount of documents that suddenly can land on your desk one day from an unknown source. The hacking that's going on by states and by other interested parties who are then just dropping it in your lap. It's a little bit like having a time bomb, because actually in a lot of countries it's illegal to receive these things. And how you use them, how you access them, is a very, very difficult issue. So plenty of stories to be looking at the moment, but it's become much more complicated simply because everything leaves an electronic trail. So, for example, in the United States, investigative journalists have had their telephone records subpoenaed by prosecutors. It's become much more risky, actually. More risky than the days when someone would give you a briefcase of documents, as with the Pentagon Papers many years ago. Everything leaves a trail now, and that poses risks of its own.
Pavla, what is there to investigate in the Czech Republic? What is there to investigate in the Czech Republic? What is the focus of your work?
I mean, there are plenty of things you can investigate. You can actually just walk around the city and see the stories. But what I like to investigate and
what do you investigate?
Yeah, what we do money laundering and organized crime mostly. It's fun, usually.
Tell me the focus.
You're having fun doing it. I mean,
we get to it. How big part investigative journalism is for Radio Free Europe, and what you guys are focusing on?
I just sketched down a small list of some of the investigations that we've done in the past year or so. We have some of this gets into English, but a lot of this is in the original languages of the services that did these stories. We have a program called Schemes in Ukraine. Schemes focuses on corruption. They have done really strong pieces, one called From Russia with Cash, about oligarch money flowing into Great Britain, particularly London. Some of the most expensive real estate in the world has been basically laundered by many of the oligarchs who have, through corrupt means, taken money out of Russia in particular. They also have investigated the current Ukrainian President Poroshenko. He had a fabulous villa in Costa del Sol, which was not declared on his property reports, even though he's a billionaire. They looked into that. We also, for example, recently did an investigation about the Swedish truck attack. If you'll recall, a number of people were killed in Stockholm when a truck ran people down. Our Tajik and Uzbek services did an investigation. They looked through all the publicly released documents from the Swedish investigation, and they found some WhatsApp pseudonyms or noms de guerre of the people communicating with the truck driver. Those went unnoticed by the Swedish prosecutors. Our people recognized those names as people who had done jihadi YouTube videos in Tajikistan. They spoke to Tajik security services who knew the real names of those people, and then the Swedish investigators were put in touch with the Tajik services because of our story, and that helped develop that. We work a lot with Bellingcat. We've had training on how to use social media. If you're aware, the MH17 was pretty definitively proved to be shot down by a Russian missile through a myriad of social media posts from a wide variety of different sources. It's really hard to refute that this was a Russian missile that brought down MH17. We've had training from that. Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP. We work regularly with them. Our Azerbaijani service helped them go through the Panama Papers. A lot of money has gone through from the Azerbaijani government to the daughters of Aliyev. The Aliyev family, their daughters have become extremely wealthy with telecom.
Yeah, they have like plenty of assets in Czech Republic, and actually the deputy director of anti-corruption unit last year invested over 100 millions of euros into real estate in Prague and Mariánské Lázně.
I could go on. We also have a polygraph.info website, which basically works to debunk false and fake news reporting.
Tim, I can imagine that investigative journalists have never been popular among certain groups, you know, like governments, the organizations, criminal or legal, they were investigating. And for decades, you know, there were killings of these journalists. But I have a feeling that there is some sort of increased hostility towards not only investigative journalists, but also against journalists in general around the world. Do you see this, and is it really happening, and why do you think it's happening, and why is it happening now?
Absolutely no doubt that is true. There was a recent survey of journalists internationally, and 88% of those journalists asked said they felt under greater threat than they did 5 or 10 years ago. I think partly it's the political polarization, because in that survey the journalists who felt most at risk were from 3 countries: United States, Italy and Hungary. And those are 3 countries where political polarization is very pronounced. I think on top of that, you've got having to deal with this flood of social media the whole time. The news cycle is so much shorter, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on journalists to get that story. I can't tell you how many times I've picked up the phone in Iraq or wherever, and the news desk has said, Twitter says this. If I ever get my hands on that guy Twitter, there will be a problem, because we are being led by social media in a way that just wasn't the case 10 years ago. That gets away a little bit from where you started, but I definitely think the political mood, if you like, is the worst part of the job now. And we've had very direct threats made to our journalists, our headquarters in Atlanta, and in a country where you can buy a semi-automatic weapon like you can buy a loaf of bread, that's pretty disturbing. I mean, individuals and their family members who are mainstream journalists in the United States regularly receive death threats now. And that's because of the political mood. But also, I think the very notion of journalism has changed, because you've got so many people who are now posing as journalists, who blog and who put stuff on social media, who are not the traditional definition of journalists. They have an axe to grind. They're not neutral observers. They're not the public's eyes and ears. They are party to these conflicts that are going on. And for the public as a whole, that's very difficult to work out who are the journalists who want to inform you, who want to find out what's being done in the people's name, and how many people are out there posing as journalists who are really not offering anything but their own partisan viewpoint, disguised as journalism, and using all the platforms that simply did not exist 10 years ago, using all those platforms to promote those opinions, those attitudes.
When it comes to threat to journalists, investigative journalists, I think very few people have such a close experience as Pavla does. Pavla Holcová was one of the closest, or if the closest, associates of working on several stories of young Slovak journalist Kuciak, murdered earlier this year in Slovakia. Can you please tell us the story you were working on, and can you tell us about the experience about his murder and about what followed up with you?
Yeah, actually, we've been working on this story for something like a year and a half, and what we were trying to do, it was to do bulletproof story, actually, on links between high-profile politicians of Slovakia, including the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister now, Robert Fico, and his links to one of the most powerful Italian mafia that is called 'Ndrangheta. And we still didn't have the final proof of saying, okay, those are 'Ndranghetistas, and actually they were benefiting of the assistant of Robert Fico, Mária Trošková, because she was leaking them information and so on. We made the story a bit softer, but we didn't finish the story. It was something like the week before we were going to publish the story, Jana was killed. So at the end we published unfinished story as a statement for a couple of reasons. First, to make it as a statement, and second, to take down the risks, the risk of other people who were also working on the story being killed.
But what followed was also extremely horrifying. And can you tell us about what followed when you were invited to Bratislava for what's supposed to be an interrogation or witness account regarding this murder, and how that turned out?
Yeah, it was actually pretty weird, because right after the murder, after the information about the murder went public, me and my family, we went under police protection. So just like 2 days after the murder, I was taken for the first time to Slovakia for witness testimony. And, you know, it was like, because it just started, the police protection, I went to Slovakia like in helicopter with bulletproof vest, and you know, it was like really big time. And they took me for an interview that actually took 1 hour, and they didn't ask a single question related to my work. They asked questions that they can actually Google in 10 minutes, like how tall he was, when did he buy his house, was he by his own doing the reparation works on the house. So I was like surprised by this line of questioning. And when the police protection was going to be evaluated, so something like 2 months after the murder, I was invited once again to go for the witness testimony. But it turned out to be interrogation. It took 8 hours. Altogether, I have like 4 minutes break after 4 hours, and another 4 minutes break after 6 hours. 3 people were questioning me. They printed out all the information from Jano's computer, and they were asking me the names and again and again, and they actually showed me pretty obviously that they don't trust my answers. And in the middle of the interrogation, actually they took my phone, that they need the information, and the problem was they never really explained why they need my phone. And I said, okay, I have the conversation with Jano Kuciak. I can give it to you because I have it on my computer. I did a backup. It's not anymore on my phone. And they said, okay, but we are especially interested in the conversation that happened after the murder. What was kind of implying that I might be guilty, that I might have some information. And when I refused to give them the phone, they took out the seizure order and they said, okay, you actually don't have much choice. We are taking your phone because we've got from the public prosecutor, we've got a seizure order. And actually here it was written that I was withholding, that they need my phone and they need all the data from my phone starting 1st of January 2016. And that they want the phone because I was withholding information from Jano that his life is in danger.
Once again, this is not a tale from Kyrgyzstan. This is a tale from Slovakia involving a Czech independent journalist, both countries members of EU. Bruce, tell me, what kind of challenges are your journalists in those, you are working in a little bit rougher countries, although perhaps not anymore. What kind of challenges your journalists of Radio Free Europe are facing and yes, what kind of dangers they are in?
Well, we do work in Kyrgyzstan, as you
I know.
just mentioned. Kyrgyzstan is not quite so bad as some other places that we work, but we have really great challenges because we work in a lot of countries with authoritarian governments or where the media is not free or partially free. We have a blogger who worked for us who is now in custody of Ukrainian separatists, Russia-backed separatists. His name is Stanislav Asayev. He's on a hunger strike right now. There's a campaign underway to get him released in some way, but the separatists are threatening to arrest his mother to put more pressure on him to stop his hunger strike. Some of you may have heard one of the worst attacks on journalists this year, if not in a very long time, was in Afghanistan, in Kabul. 9 journalists were killed in one attack in Kabul by a suicide bomber. A suicide bombing went off. The journalists gathered to cover it. A second suicide bomber killed 9. 3 of those were working for us, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Those people knew every single day they were risking their lives to bring information and news to us. There are people who go into this business for the spotlight, for fame, for money, and there are people who go into this business to make the world a better place, to bring information, to help society and democracy, and are willing to risk their lives for it. And they gave their lives for it so we could know what's going on. And there are many people who don't want you to know what's going on. And those are not just the Taliban or ISIS in Afghanistan. Those are oligarchs, those are governments, those are people who smile and tell you everything's fine, nothing to see here, don't worry about it. There's really bad things going on that need to be reported that people like Pavla are uncovering, and people are working to stop them from covering. We need people like you to be aware of that and to support these rare breed of people who just not only have the talent and the skill to do this type of work, but also the courage.
Tim, you also covered, extensively recently ISIS in Syria, ISIS in Iraq. You were exposed to these dangers. But these are obvious things, like people die in wars, even journalists. What I would like to now follow is, you mentioned this polarization, you mentioned this politicization of news. To me, attack on journalists, attack on independent media is an attack on democracy, on basic democratic values. But what do you think is happening now? Why leaders like Donald Trump are, attacking media? Why leaders like Czech President Zeman is threatening with physical violence to journalists? What's going on in the world? What do you think is happening that the governments actually are attacking the journalists of their own countries?
How long have we got? I mean, it's so difficult to unravel all that, but you do have a political current now that has grown, I would say certainly in the US and in Western Europe since 2008, where you have a section of the population which, for many reasons, is out of love with democracy, feels betrayed by elites. This is what Trump has obviously harnessed as his core support. And you also have, since the financial crisis and the mass unemployment of 2008, the jobs that have come back are unskilled or semi-skilled. The good-paying jobs, the manufacturing jobs that people used to have disappeared. That's why Brexit happened, because a lot of British people saw migrants coming from Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe and taking jobs that were available. There were no other jobs left. So you've got this widespread resentment and distrust, and the media is very much part of that elite that has let people down. So is the European Union bureaucracy in Brussels, so are the merchant bankers on Wall Street, but the media is a very big part of that for a lot of people. And whatever Trump does, it's fascinating that the 40% that support him are rock solid. Nothing moves them. He can say anything because they believe, most of the time, the liberal media is lying about Trump. They have one source of news, it's Fox News. And they have the right-wing talk radio stations that are all over the United States. So the partisanship in Europe, in the United States, is tremendous. And I think that is at root why the media is much more under threat, is much more criticized. But coming back to one thing that you mentioned, I think it's really important that when independent journalists do work, that the bigger organizations like CNN, like the New York Times, like the BBC, actually join in and protect them, because we have much more in the way of protection, we have much more in the way of resources. That applies to a combat zone, it applies to a corruption investigation. I was delighted to see that after the murder of the Maltese blogger and journalist last year, 5 or 6 big media organizations just picked up the torch and carried on her work. We're going through all the documents and the data that she'd got. We need to do that with stories like the one in Slovakia. We need to do that with stories that you've been doing. We worked with an independent Russian newspaper about the Internet Research Agency, the famous group in St. Petersburg that was doing all the trolling and so forth in the United States. They're really brave people. And they were prepared to talk to us and share what they'd learned with us. They have no protections. The oligarchs can do anything to them the day after tomorrow. So we need to step up as big media organizations, because a lot of the really great work now is being done by independent journalists. It's great to see, but they need help.
Pavla, tell me, do you believe that the murder of Jan Kuciak will be resolved? And why do you think yes, why do you think not?
Well, I hope it's going to be resolved, and I need to stick to that hope, because otherwise the world would be like pretty depressive place. But to be honest, only about 10% of the murders of a journalist are, investigated properly, and the people who are guilty are found. But I believe that it's not only the work of the police, but also the journalists keep on asking questions and keep on running their own line of investigation. So I believe we may get closer to what happened, even if there will be some political pressure on the Slovak police not to investigate properly, or to, break the investigation into 100 little pieces. So, yeah, I hope it's going to be one day properly investigated, and one day we are going to have a better picture of what really happened.
Bruce, in last 10, 15 years within Radio Free Europe, do you see increasing hostility growing towards journalists from local governments, from local authorities, and how is that? And I don't mean necessarily war zones. You know, I mean Ukraine, I mean other, you know, Russia, of course, you know, other services.
To be honest, I think it's been fairly consistent. I would even point to one bright spot, Uzbekistan right now. The longtime leader passed away not long ago, and the new authoritarian, undemocratic leader has been releasing political prisoners, including journalists who have been held many, many years in prisons in Uzbekistan, and is actually talking with us and other people about accreditation for journalists in Uzbekistan. We have no bureau there, but maybe someday. But Russia, I've got numerous examples of our journalists have been attacked and beaten. We were covering a Navalny protest recently. Our anchor was reporting live, and he was seized by Russian police live on camera and bundled away in the middle of that. Turkmenistan, we have a contributor. We have no office in Turkmenistan. It's a very authoritarian government, a very closed society. We had a woman in her 60s has been contributing to us, and she's been attacked 8 times in the last year working for us. I can't give you some sense of up or down graph. I just know that we had a correspondent who, in I think 2007 in Turkmenistan, was imprisoned and died while in custody there. We've just got, I made a list of the last year and a half of 13 major incidents involving just our organization, from the closing down of our office in Pakistan. We had some journalists on their way to the tribal territories to cover an auto rally, and someone driving behind them spotted a magnetic bomb under the bottom of their car. They alerted the authorities. The authorities arrested our correspondent and held them for about a day to ask them why they should have a bomb under their car. So, yeah, there's plenty of stories like that. I don't have a trend for you.
Yeah. When I was for 7 years, I was based in China, and I was arrested and detained 23 times. But one would expect that in China. It was like I thought, I'm doing my job if I'm being arrested. So, but I want to talk. Tim, you and I had a conversation last week over the phone, and you told me that it seems that all the normal rules that existed for journalists in democratic countries, such as United States, such as European Union, are being eroded. You mentioned a case in Italy, for example, where the Italian government lifted the police protection of journalists who were investigating mafia. Why is that happening? Is it the political shift to populism, political shift to the right, political shift to authoritarianism in many of those countries? Why is this shift happening? Why?
Well, it comes back to what we were talking about previously, but there's no doubt that in certain European countries that the shift to the right, you only have to look at Hungary, has been bad news for the media because there's less tolerance. It's quite simple. So the Italian Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, he was criticized by a journalist who's done a lot of very, very good work investigating the mafia. So he publicly told this journalist, right, you're going to lose your police protection. You're a journalist in Italy that investigates the mafia without police protection. You're not going to get a life insurance policy very easily from anybody. That's the sort of unbelievable threat that's being made to what I regard as a pillar of the democracy, along with an independent judiciary, independent prosecution service. And you see also in some parts of Europe, the idea of an independent prosecution service and an independent judiciary is also being attacked. Poland, for example. So the environment has become much more difficult to work in. And I think the other factor is this has all been turbocharged, if you will, by the current occupant of the White House. His attitude towards the media, the lying media, as he calls it, which is a phrase that was used endlessly by Adolf Hitler, incidentally, if he's attacking the media, what chance has the US ambassador in, say, Myanmar got going to the authorities and saying, you need to release these journalists, it's an affront to democracy? They haven't got a leg to stand on, because the message from Washington is, we don't care, really, what happens to journalists. And I think, by and large, the protection of journalists has fallen down, and indeed the promotion of human rights has fallen down the list of to-do things when you're confronting a government that behaves badly. Look at the case of Turkey or Egypt. A half of all the journalists in prison last year were in China, Egypt, and Turkey. You very rarely see public efforts by other governments to bring these states to account and say, you can't do this. There's no sanction, there's no threat. The whole idea of protecting journalists has just fallen off a cliff, fallen off the agenda of most Western governments. It just doesn't matter anymore.
Pavla, with your case, I mean, Slovakia is one thing, you know, that is how the Slovak police behaved and Slovak authorities. But do you feel threatened in working what you are doing in the Czech Republic? Are you receiving threats, you know, and do you feel any support from the authorities, you know, including the police? You know, how is the working environment for you in the Czech Republic?
I mean, kind of get used to it, because, I mean, you receive kind of threats every week, and usually when Jana was murdered, I got a couple of interviews with police officers from witness protection program, because those were the guys who were taking care of me and my family. And they were asking crazy questions such as, you know, do you receive weird messages? And I said, like, yeah, all the time. Oh, do you receive kind of suspicious messages? Yeah, like once a week. I said, okay, but you're a special case, so we can't. But yeah, we are often threatened. And actually the biggest message for me from the murder is that I can't really make proper risk assessment myself, because I didn't see it coming. I didn't see that Jana would be in danger. So I don't trust my instincts anymore. But the good thing is that the police officers who were providing the police protection, they were really good. I mean, on both sides of professional attitude and human attitude as well.
What do you think of President Zeman's statements regarding journalists and the impact that it's had?
It would be funny if it wouldn't be so sad. I mean, like, posing with a toy gun with inscription on journalists is one thing, but joking about eliminating the journalists with Vladimir Putin is like far too away.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have some 20 minutes left. I would like to, for the first time, open the floor to the questions from the audience. If anybody has any questions regarding the topic. Can we have the microphone?
That's good.
In my lifetime growing up in the States, there was just, you know, 3 networks, big and powerful, all of your local news. The entire landscape of journalism has changed completely in my lifetime. That's Murdoch, you know, with his tabloid journalism. That's CNN coming onto the scene, also the social media. It feels like the basic trust of journalists with their local communities has been broken, partially by this incredible division into so many sources and so many avenues. So that for me is what I notice myself. My father studied journalism, and he doesn't like journalists. He's a Trump guy too. So I see it in my own family that they've grown distant from something that they used to put all of their trust and belief in. How does that trust get rebuilt when there's so many of you competing for... Everyone in this room cares about what you care about, but everyone who's not here, their eyeballs are being pulled somewhere else. How do you fix that trust?
That's just a brilliant question. I completely agree with every word you say. I'm heartened by one thing, and that is the engagement of younger people in the US, and they are buying into quality journalism again. Subscriptions to the New York Times and to other, really well-established newspapers and other media outlets that are spending serious money on investigative journalism. That is very hopeful. I hope also that this generation has much greater sense of distinguishing between the crap, frankly, that's out there on social media, which is disguised as journalism, which I referenced earlier, which is the biggest problem we've got at the moment, is that a lot of people, particularly given that the news cycle has shortened now, that, a story that is new at 12 o'clock is dead by 6 o'clock. It's just extraordinary how quickly things move on. That in itself is an enemy of doing things properly. The competition for posed by social media, that we have to constantly be checking out all the garbage that's out there instead of actually getting on with our work. New York Times said, we're not going to do this incremental stuff anymore. We're just going to focus on original stories, and we're going to go our own way, and we've got the money to do it. Those are the critical things. But is there an easy answer? No, I think the social media giants have to be much more responsible. And you see that in funny ways, not so funny actually, in ways like WhatsApp now in India is going to prevent people from forwarding rumors because they've led to people being lynched and killed in the last few weeks and months. So they've got to take a responsibility as well. But is it an uphill struggle? You bet. It's really, really tough in this environment.
I have a particularly dark view of that. I think that there's a famous quote from New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which is, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, guess where we are now?
Right.
People are entitled to their own facts. There are alternate facts.
Yep.
And how do we fix that? Decades have been spent investing in alternative structures of media and platforms to serve very particular audiences, and I don't think that will be undone in any short period of time. There is quality journalism being done, investment is going into that, and that will serve a particular audience very well. And the pendulum swings back and forth in society and in the world, and it may swing in a positive direction, and it'll swing back.
But just to follow up, I think one of the alarming things is that the New York Times really depends on a Mexican billionaire. The Washington Post depends on Jeff Bezos of Amazon. The Huffington Post, we know where the money comes from there. So if you don't have these philanthropists, then real mainstream journalism, expensive journalism, going through the Panama Papers, for example, one example, going through WikiLeaks, it's not going to, I don't know what's going to happen to CNN now that AT&T have taken over CNN. Maybe they don't want us anymore. I don't know. It's a very perilous situation for your mainstream journalism, but frankly, that's the only thing with the training and the resources and the lawyers and all the rest of it that's going to deliver some of the investigative work that needs to be done on a multitude of subjects over the coming years.
Pavla, how difficult it is for you and your organization to find funding for your work?
It's extremely difficult because we can't just take the money from big players. We can't take the money from the state. We can't take the money from people who base their business on the privatization. We can't take the money from anyone who is anyhow affiliated to the politics. So we got grants, and we got individual donors, and that's it. But we've got really, really low burn rate. So that's how we actually try to fix the issue that we don't have enough money. And right now we are army of 4 people, so that's keeping it cheap.
And what is your feeling? Is Czech public willing to pay for journalism you are doing? Because investigative journalism is very expensive, it's a very labor heavy thing. Do you think that people are willing to pay for it?
No. But it's changing. Fortunately, it's changing. I mean, if the publishers would be able to go back to the end of 90s and paywalled articles from the beginning, not actually giving the content for free, believing in online advertisement, they would kill for it now, these days. But what I believe is changing now, that people start to actually adopt the journalists. They choose one or two they trust and they subscribe to them. And that's probably the model for the future. At least I hope so. And actually, if you remember the advertisement, the best things are for free. I hope that's going to change.
Next, there is some...
Hi, I'm Susan Cora. I'm a Canadian journalist. I want to pick up on a point that I think Bruce made about big media supporting independent journalists. I personally have independent journalist friends who got into big trouble in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Now, how, in practical terms, would that work? Would they sort of sign up as freelancers to the New York Times or whatever? I mean, so that's my question.
So by independent journalists, you mean freelancers?
Yes, who don't have the support of, like you said, the big media behind them, CNN or whatever.
It's a very delicate and difficult question. I can tell you, for example, we had a freelancer who covered the Iraqi government military retaking Mosul in 2016. He was hit by a rocket and he lost an eye and nearly died. He's a freelancer. He's not covered by our company insurance or all these other things. Special efforts had to be made to pay for his medical care. Collection was taken up among all the journalists in Prague working for Radio Free Europe to help turn his life around. It's not a good situation. We have a large staff, and then we have a lot of freelancers. I've had people write to me saying, I want to go into Syria and shoot photos for you, and I will send them to you, and will you pay me for those photos? And there's a big ethical quandary there, because we know this guy doesn't have support, or this woman doesn't have support, doesn't have the proper insurance, may not have had hostile environment training, may not have the proper protective equipment. And, as much as people have courage and the skills and want to go in and cover a war zone, ultimately we don't think it's a good idea to encourage independent freelancers to go risk their lives for $100 for a photograph.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think Mosul was terrifying in many ways. I was there when the campaign started by the Kurds and the Iraqi army, and you couldn't move for tripping over freelance journalists who were hoping that they would get that shot that would turn them into a star overnight. A lot of them had arrived in the area poorly equipped with zero training, zero protective gear, no sense of what actually life is like in a combat zone and where to put yourself. And they became a danger to everybody. They became a danger to the Kurds who were trying to look after them. They became a danger to the rest of the journalists who were just trying to do the job, but at least had a vague sense of where to go and when to shoot and when not to shoot. A massive problem. And we tried to work with some of these people in terms of helping them, giving them advice on places they absolutely shouldn't go, and even Iraqi army units they shouldn't trust. But what's happened is that the ready availability of a lot of cheap camera gear, much better communications, anybody can go, cheap flight, Erbil, get a taxi, go out to the front line. It was that simple. And they have a cheap camera, and they get back to the hotel, and they're sending pictures, or they're sending reports, and what have you. But it's a problem, and we ought to do more to support them, but on the other hand, we ought to do more to discourage them. James Foley was killed by ISIS in Syria because he was a classic freelance. He was sending photographs into AFP and others, and he stopped on his way out of Syria because he thought it was getting spooky. He stopped at a cafe to upload some photographs. 10 minutes later, a bunch of armed guys in a car came, collected him. They sold him to ISIS. End of story. So it's incredibly dangerous, these places, and people just need to be able to go to organizations like IRE and others, CPJ, to get the lowdown on what it's really like before doing that.
Yeah, let me just add a comment of independent journalist. I mean, the support often is not about employing independent journalists or freelancer, but for me it was essential to see the support when they seized my phone.
Yeah.
And actually that was the point when I just told my friends, like, yeah, they took my phone, I'm sad now, let's do something, and they did. And actually the international pressure and the pressure of the people like you here made them to give the phone back.
Right. And the Washington Post in particular were very helpful
Yes.
to you, right?
Yes, because we were at the same panel just like a week before, and it was like, what?
That's such an important point, because now more than ever we have to have solidarity in the profession amongst people we trust and value and respect their work. If we don't, then it's going to be a very short path to hell for the entire profession, I'm afraid.
Another question?
Hello, I have a question for Bruce. A couple of days ago, Radio Free Europe announced the plans to go back to Romania and Bulgaria. I want to know, why did you choose those countries? Because I think that in Poland or Hungary or probably in the Czech Republic or Slovak Republic, the situation is the same, if not worse.
I don't really have a lot I can add to that. I not involved in the decision. I basically read a press release like you did, so I can't say what the real reason was. I can say that there are a lot of other countries we would like to be in. We've had talks about going into Turkey. We've talks about even, and this is serious, it was discussed a few years ago, Germany and Italy, doing a Radio Free Europe in German. I'd love to see Radio Free Europe in back in Czech Republic again. Why not? But why those particular countries? I mean, they have each their own particular challenges. Both have issues with corruption, maybe a little bit worse than some other places in the world. I don't know if that was the main reason or not, but there's certainly plenty to do in those countries with the type of work that we do, which is to try to shine a light on those types of issues.
Could you come to England and explain Brexit for us? Because I don't know the hell's going on with Brexit, so...
Radio Free England, that would be...
Yeah, I like it.
Is there any other question?
Sorry. I have a question for Pavla. How has your work changed after the murder?
Got more intense. We used to work like 10 hours a day. Now it's like 14 hours a day. And we still work on finishing the stories. We started with Jano. Probably next week one is going to be out, once again about Slovakia. But otherwise it didn't change much. I talk more often at the conferences.
The thing is that I've heard that you somehow don't believe your instincts anymore. That was the question about.
In terms of security, in terms of assessing the risks, I don't. But I have people who now are checking if I'm right, like every second day or every day. That's new for me. And I am more aware of the fact that at least someone needs to know where I am. So I am letting people know where I'm going, what I didn't do before. And I took a couple of the measures and I follow them.
There was another question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a journalist from Slovakia, a country that's been already mentioned today a few times, a country that's undergoing so many sort of terrible things right now, very sort of courageous articles being written, however not much being investigated or done about, you know, your findings, Pavla, and Jan Kuciak's, of course. At the same time, we have a public broadcaster that seems to be falling apart because all of the best journalists are being fired, let go, or are leaving. We're fed up as journalists. Do you have any advice for us of how to keep going? We're being called the weirdest of names from our political representatives. Do you have any inspiration for us of why or how to go on?
Yeah, start your own media. That's probably the best advice. You need to start your own media center. I don't, because in Slovakia, that's why we actually cover Slovakia as well. There was nothing like Czech Center for Investigative Journalism, so it's time for you to start one. Just you need to get used to the fact that you won't have much money, you probably won't be able to pay your rent, and you need army of volunteers at the beginning just to take care of even of the small stories. But you know that's probably the only answer to such a situation. And you've got great now freelance journalists.
There is a question there.
Please, can anybody shortly comment the situation regarding Julius Assange? I just only read that he lived several years in Ecuador embassy with bad situation. But
yeah, we've actually done quite a lot of investigation into Julian Assange's position and his status, and the status essentially at the moment is unchanged. There is reason to believe that somewhere in the Washington area there is a sealed indictment prepared by the Mueller team because they regard Assange as part of this Russian disinformation operation. That would obviously only come out if a prosecution and if a trial eventually comes about, but first they'd have to extradite Julian Assange from the United Kingdom, which they might, given that the extradition law in the United Kingdom allows for the American authorities, without showing a whole ton of evidence, to extradite people. So for now, he's stuck in that embassy, and he has been deprived of internet access and so forth. There's been a change of government in Ecuador, which has not been to his favor. We are led to believe there were plans at one point to spirit him out of the embassy across the rooftops, although God knows where he'd go. There was also some talk about a backdoor deal by which he would go to Ecuador and stay there, much as Snowden has stayed in Russia, and that would be that. It would all be over. But right now, it's paralysis. Certain people who've been in there and seen him are concerned for his psychological state, as you might imagine. After 6 years in one room in a small bathroom, it's enough to make you a little crazy.
You know, I have one comment at the end and question. You know, I am actually, you said that people are not willing to pay for the journalism you are doing. But on the other side, look at what happened after Jan's murder in Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands of people went to the streets, outraged by this. They forced the government, Fico, and the interior minister to resign. I talked to the organization Jan worked for in Slovakia, the Actuality.sk. They almost doubled that investigative team. You know, it was they hired more people and they started, you know, double the efforts, you start working harder. I do have hope that people will actually, you said that New York Times and other serious news outlets are, the subscriptions are up again by young people.
And the other thing is that the New York Times is one of those organizations after Daphne Galizia's murder in Malta that pitched up, and they created this collective called Forbidden Papers. And they went to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament were blown away by what they had to say and gave them a ton of money. Not a ton of money, but quite a decent sum of money. So there was an example of a tragic event leading to a much greater sense of solidarity amongst journalists who are independent, who work for big media. Süddeutsche Zeitung was another of the group that involved in this collective. And they picked up and they found out some amazing stuff about Maltese politicians that Daphne was working on. So there is hope. It just needs a tremendous sort of spirit and collective effort, because some of the opposition out there, some of the obstacles are too big for one organization. There needs to be some sort of collective spirit to be able to deal with this.
Bruce, I know you are a pessimist usually. Your closing comments?
Pessimist.
I'm a pessimist. I think I do think we're in a dark place right now, and I don't know when we're going to get out of that or how. Of course, I hope we do, but I just wanted to say, I was at a party and I asked some person who I had just met, what he thought about what was going on in Russia at the time, and he said, one side says one thing, the other side says the other. I don't know what to believe anymore, so I don't pay attention to it. And I said, well, that's exactly what certain people want to happen. And it brought to mind this quote from Hannah Arendt, who is famous for writing a book, Banality of Evil, and the origins of totalitarianism many decades ago, but it's very instructive for our time. She wrote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and true and false no longer exist." And that's the danger, that's the road we're on right now. And I would say to all of you, do your homework, look for facts, look for credible sources, not just the most intriguing or emotional or exciting. Read carefully, look carefully, educate yourself, and hopefully that'll lead us to a better place.
Pavla, anything else to add?
I mean, I'm optimistic. You all came. I mean, that's the optimism I can see, and actually it brings optimism in me. So, yeah, I believe we should be optimistic, right?
I'm trying.
Great ending. Thank you very much. I mean, I believe we live in times that in our lifetime, your work has never been more important than what we are living through right now. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for listening.
Cheers, man.